Okay, so this is going to be the intro to texturing, and we're just going to get into sort of the most basic and direct form of texturing that we can do, right? So this is a dagger that I've created based on the work of Optinium. It's got some like outlines on it, a little bit of like, highlighting and that sort of thing. It's very work in progress, but this is sort of how you will get started doing the most basic, straightforward textures you can come up with, right? So let's assume that we have some sort of a prop, right? And I'm going to expand my layout so that I get access to the UVs here, right? And I'm going to check the UVs of this prop, right? Now, my prop, its UVs are actually stretched. Sorry, give me a second. They're stretched twice as wide because I eventually know that this is going to be a rectangular texture because I don't need all of this for this dagger, so I'm going to try and use as little texture space as I can. So I've made the dagger here twice as thick horizontally so that when I create a new image, it will get smushed back. So don't be too concerned about this shape here. The long and the short of it is you just need a unwrap. You need a valid unwrap. So that's step one, right? We need a valid unwrap. Step two is we're going to have to give it some sort of a material, right? So we'll go file new and we'll just call this like M underscore dagger, something like that, right? Now we're going to go over to the UV window, right, which I've added here by going right-clicking on the edge of the viewport and hitting split vertical, and then in the top left changing the viewport to the UV editor. Instead of doing that, you can click up to here we go, UV editing. This is functionally the same thing, right? So from here, now that we've got our dagger, we need to create a new texture file, right? So we would click up here where there's this new button, and here there's these three key buttons, right? There's this drop down on the left, which sort of shows you all the images Blender currently has loaded. There's the new button and the open button, right? I'm going to go new, and I'm going to call this T underscore dagger, right? Now, I'm going to give it some base value that's roughly in the middle of the range, just sort of personal preference. And we can choose the width and height here, right? 1024 wide and high. I'm going to make this a rectangular texture because this is sort of like a rectangular prop, right? So it doesn't really make sense to waste a bunch of the stuff on the other side. If this was a sword and shield combo, then maybe we could just use a square texture because we would be effectively utilizing all of our resources. But for now, I'm just going to type 512 in the width, and I'm going to have a height of 1024, right? Now, you can make these as big as you want. In general, you want these to be larger than they are smaller, right? Because you actually want, like, when you're mastering this, you want to use as much quality as you need, and then you're going to scale that down and put it on the game engine, right? The game engine will eventually be lower resolution than these, but you can only go down and not really up, so it's sort of worth it to start larger and come down, right? So I've given it a name, I've given it a width and a height, and some, default sort of initialized color. Then I'm going to hit new image, right? Now at this point, this image is just floating around in memory, like in Blender. And if your file crashes right now, it's gone. You'd have to remake it, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go image, and then we're going to go save, and we're going to just give it some sort of a file on disk. T underscore dagger. Now, while I'm working, I actually turn compression just off. This is going to make your file size much bigger, but Blender's not going to like lose any, quality or anything like that. And we're going to leave everything else default. So I just do this sort of every time, and I save that image. Cool. So we've made an image file, right? But we're not using it. We have an object which has an unwrap, and you can now see it's no longer stretched like that, right? Because the texture's squished by half, so the UVs now look normal. So we've got our model with our UVs, we've got a material. Now we actually need to assign this texture to this object, right? Now by default, when we create a material, its surface type is going to be Principled BSDF. I'm going to click this, and I'm going to switch this over to emission, right? All this means is that sort of whatever color we pipe in, just be that color, I guess, is sort of an average way of thinking about it, provided your strength is 1. So we're going to leave strength as 1, and we've got color here. Now, by default, we could give this an RGB color, but we're not going to do that because we're going to texture that. So we're going to leave this completely white, right? So completely white color, no strength. On the left of color, there's this little like yellow dot here. I'm going to click that. That's going to let me change from an RGB color over to an image texture, right? So I'm going to click the image texture, and now this gives us a very familiar like window, little set of dialogues here. We had the drop down, we had new, and we had open. And And we saw that up here in the UV menu, but because this UV menu is now active on Dagger, that no longer shows here. But this material doesn't have any textures active, so it shows those defaults, right? Instead of going new, because we've already made and saved one, we could either open one from the disk, but we're obviously not going to do that because we're going to texture here. We want to click this little drop down instead, and then select Dagger, right? So now it would probably be a great idea to save like an incremental copy of your file. What we have now is like a mesh that's ready to be textured. We have the mesh itself, we've got the texture file, we've got the material, and it's set, right? But we also want to change in our, I believe it's render. We go to the scene rendering settings, we scroll all the way down to color management, we go view transform. By default, I think Blender has this on AGX. I want you to swap this over to standard. The reason we want to swap it over to standard is because the Blender viewport's not going to do any more color correction. It's just going to show your texture on your mesh as it is on the file. And that's really important when we're doing like texturing work because we don't really want Blender to distort anything, right? So we're going to do that. Now, at this point, we can then hold Control and hit Tab or click up here in object mode. We want to enter texture painting mode, right? Now, expanding this a little bit, so we've got our texture here on the left. We've got our 3D viewport here. If I tap N and go to Tool, we can have a look at the different brush settings, right? But the basic premise now is that now we're in this mode, I can pick any color I want, like some sort of like bright color or something, and I can immediately start painting directly onto this object, right? And the strength is going to be controlled up here, like how strong like your color comes in when you're in blend mode mix by the strength value, right? And so this is sort of how, this is like the most basic and direct sort of method of texturing, is you literally just pick colors and you just start painting, right? And this, I'm doing this with a mouse. This is literally all I did here. There's absolutely nothing fancy here. It's just this, picking colors, right? Picking really bright ones for sort of highlights, painting with a low opacity, and then just sort of painting and painting and painting until you get some result which looks good, right? If you hold Shift, sorry, let me turn on my screencast keys. If you hold Shift and tap X, whatever you mouse over is going to set that color into your active. There's sort of an active slot and a secondary slot. If I tap just regular X, I can flip between the secondary and active slots. So it's kind of good to have like your darker color in one slot, and then you swap over to your brighter color. Maybe you sample a little bit here and then paint some more, right? But that's literally it. This is like the straight, just, you know, it's very straightforward to actually texture something, but it takes a great deal of time, patience, and skill to actually make it look good, right? We can also flip our blend settings, right? These are definitely worth experimenting with, so feel free to like go through here. But, you know, if we switch from mix to add, that's going to take whatever color I have here and start adding that color onto anything underneath, right? And it's going to go all the way up to white. So if I was to have like a really dark color that's like subtly red, and I start adding, it's going to start painting like the color red down, and it will eventually push that all the way up, you know, to something really bright. So you would use that to like do bloom highlights and that kind of thing. I really want to talk about color mixing, like color blending, just a very simple way of color blending. So if I'm back in mix mode with a strength that's not full, and I take like a black color here, and I paint that, and then I take a white color and paint here. I wonder why that's being so weird with that projection there. And I drop my sensitivity back down and I paint from here to here. You can see that I'll do a little bit stronger actually, paint from here to here. You can see that it only imparts a certain amount of that value, right? It goes from black to slightly darker. If I then sample this and paint again, we're going to have a compounding effect of losing that black intensity. And I can continually do this, blending up into that white space until eventually the two blend together, right? And the reason that works is it's like, you know, we're only painting 50% or like, let's say 65% of the color down here. And then when we sample it, it's naturally not going to be black. It's going to be 65% reduced, or, you know, 35% reduced, or, you know, whatever. And we can blend that way. That is essentially all I've done here. That's literally it. It's just straight painting on one layer, just being artistic and being creative, right? So from here, there's also a lot of other settings that you'll want to muck with. There's different fall-off settings, which can control how your brush strokes are shaped when you paint, like they have different characteristics, right? There's also symmetry options for if you want the program to automatically be symmetric on one side or the other. There's normal fall off as well, which is going to prevent textures from like wrapping around to the other side. And you'll notice that when I'm painting, some sort of weirdness is happening. I currently have a mirror modifier turned on, which means that when I make brush strokes on one side, they're going to just immediately get warped over to the other side, right? That's interesting. Now I can't paint anything. All right, so this is why we want to make sure that we're always paying attention to our face orientation, right? The reason that I wasn't able to paint before was because my normals were actually flipped because I was doing some outline sort of testy work on this side. So make sure that your normals are actually facing outward, right? Because that has influence on actually how you paint and whatnot, okay? So that's how you fix that. Now you'll notice up here on image, this is really important. There's image and a little asterisk. This means that all the work we've done so far is not saved. This image hasn't been saved since it last changed, right? So we would click here and then we would go save, right? I'll just click that. And now you can see that asterisk disappears, and we get a little dialog down here saying that it's saved. Now, whenever I make a new brush stroke, it's going to show that asterisk again, right? There's a hotkey for this. If I put my mouse into the UV window and hold Alt and hit S, we can save that image, right? So there's the UV window, but there's also the image editor window. They're very similar, but not quite. See how if I swap between them, nothing really changes? But in the image editor window, we can now go over to paint, and that gives us actually a 2D painting sort of window. And it's very similar to the 3D one. It's just 2D, right? So I can hit N to bring up my menu, and I can now color pick, and I can paint over here, right? So this is really good if you want to like touch things up and like paint without any perspective kind of thing. Okay, but that's basically like the absolute sort of intro to texture painting. Like this is the most basic and direct method, but you can create some pretty cool stuff with it, right?